So let's talk about pruning mature trees. In general, you just want to thin them out. That would be the crown cleaning. It is also called thinning or lacing to make the tree a little bit more open and delicate. Thinning a tree out, always a good idea. Well, gosh, I can't really say it's always a good idea because recent research has indicated that if you thin too much, you may get more limb breakage and there may be more strain on the stem, meaning the trunk of a tree in big winds. But a little general thinning or lacing won't do any harm. And how much do I mean by a little? I guess when you're removing live branches from a tree, you should probably stick to maybe 1/8 of the foliage in a given year. And you really don't need to prune your tree more than once every 5 years. And you don't want to overthin your conifers because you might get more breakage, and you don't want to overthin your deciduous trees because you don't want to stimulate water sprouts. And the pruning budget is variable. It depends on the species, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb. This is a before picture. This is the thinning out of a weeping willow. This is the after picture. And you'll notice that it looks clean and crisp and nice. And there's a fellow on the left lower side now who's about to finish thinning out that corner so that it matches the rest of the tree. So here's the before. Looks kind of messy and dirty. And here's the after pruning. Looks rather clean and nice. I should mention that there are a couple of very large cuts on the trunk, and when the arborists came down, they said they apologized for those cuts because there's actually an upper limit to the size of side branches you can take off. In general, that side branch should be less than half the diameter of the parent stem, and that gets even less as the tree gets older. Why? Because it's just too damaging to the trunk. And they said that they had to make those cuts because those branches were actually broken, which would be the only time it would be okay. I'm trying to get a mental picture for you about how big is too big. And I can say that when I was at a pruning class at a landscape, the homeowner wanted a side branch taken off of a tree, and the arbor said, "No, I can't do that. It's too big." It was an average-sized, mid-sized, mid-aged tree, and the cut being proposed was over 4 inches. So arborists at some point don't even though it's a good removal cut, will balk if you do too much. So this is what thinning looks like. In your upper left corner is a branch which is just kind of clogging up the center of your tree, and it's been turned black by the illustrator just so you can see it. And then she's going to remove it. That would be the one underneath. And then the upper right corner, we're going to take out a lot of the smaller branches. And then the lower right corner is the finished product. And this is heavy thinning. This is not light thinning. This is heavy thinning. And that is the effect you will achieve when you thin out your tree. This is, I believe this is a saguaro cypress, and there's nothing wrong with it. Looks great. Trees don't need to be pruned to do their best work. But the person here was complaining that they just didn't get enough daylight into their back patio. So the arborists spent some quality time inside the tree and thinned it out. And it looked like this when it was done. This is not the same tree, but it's the same species of tree. So that's what thinning looks like on a conifer. So we have talked about thinning out the crown, which has all kinds of synonyms: thinning, safety prune, lacing, things of that nature. But thinning is pretty good. Now we're going to talk about crown raising, which has its own set of synonyms. That would be limbing up and skirting. And that means taking off a couple of the lower limbs, a few of the lower limbs, so that you can get under it for whatever reason you may need. So this gives you the general idea of what skirting or limbing up looks like, and this is a perfectly okay thing to do to a tree if you don't do too much, and if it solves a problem for you, then go ahead and do that. Here's a situation where these trees could probably, or the people in the cars would probably benefit with these trees limbed up a little bit more so that they can see any oncoming traffic or kids on bicycles. Another term called windowing or interlimbing, not as common, but it can work mainly on conifers. I'm trying to think of pines especially. Here's a deodar cedar that has been interlimbed. See how you can see a little bit of light through it? It's different than thinning because the branches go clear back to the trunks, the main leaders. So the pruning budget varies from tree to tree. Some trees you just look at cross-eyed, they explode into water sprouts. Other ones you can cut and cut and cut, and they won't. The only limiting factor is, will you starve it to death, and does it look silly? So the conifers, by and large, can't water sprout back. A lot of the deciduous, maybe all the deciduous trees water sprout back. Some of them are really just the nervous Nellies of the plant world, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. But briefly, they are magnolias, dogwoods, purple leaf plums, cherries, crab apples, and related plants to those. And they water sprout at just the drop of a hat, and therefore the pruning budget is much smaller. The pruning budget is made up of several factors. The size of the cuts. Big cut spends more of the budget than a little cut. So if you do one big thinning cut, you're going to want to do a lot less other things. The total amount of foliage removed, and the kinds of cuts. The heading cut, you don't pretty much ever want to do. The reduction cut is second choice, and the first choice are removal cuts or thinning cuts because they spend less of the budget. And in a given tree, I guess I'd say that 90% of your wood is dead wooding that you're cutting out. It doesn't count against the pruning budget. And then 9% or more is true thinning cuts, or also called removal cuts. And then just a few branches would be reduced. And those would be ones that had been headed before and have a horrible hydra on the end, or maybe it's the branch that's actually sticking out over the chimney. You don't want it to catch on fire, but it's really too big to take off completely, so we're just going to head it back a little bit. You don't want to completely try to make your tree into a perfect ball. That way lies madness. You need a real good reason for using the reduction cut. Doesn't mean they're not allowed, just means we want to use them sparingly. And you shouldn't be pruning your big trees. You should have professionals prune your big trees. Here's a bunch of them, and they use ropes and tie in with a special saddle. They're called arborists. The word arborist is like the word landscaper. Anybody can call themselves an arborist, but only ISA certified arborists can call themselves ISA certified arborists. And the ISA stands for International Society of Arboriculture. And when they're certified, it means they've taken a big, long test and they actually know something about trees. Right now, all you need is $90 and a chainsaw to go into the tree business. You need more credentials to become a hairstylist than to work in a 500-year-old oak. And this is one of the reasons there's so much tree damage. But you can look for an arborist in the tree service section of your Google and ask them if they are ISA certified. They will have a white card in their wallet, and they're just dying for somebody to ask them to see it. They are not offended. They are pleased because they had to do a lot of studying and pay a whole bunch of money to get the certification. And these are guys who know the difference between good and bad pruning. Arborist means tree person. And lucky for us, there are finally some pruning standards which have been created for the American National Standards Institute. That's ANSI, ANSI. ANSI standards. They make standards for everything from, plumbing and carpentry and whatever else needs standards. They're the guys that cook it up and publish it. And the pruning standards are called the A300s, A300 pruning standards. And if you're going to have work done on your tree, you want people to bid to the A300 pruning standards. You don't need to know what they are. You just need to know to specify them. And then if you hire somebody to prune to the A300s and instead they top your tree, you can sue them for a goodly amount of money because you actually asked them to prune to A300 standards. So let's talk about young trees. We'll start at the beginning. Young trees. Dr. Shigo, who I refer to often, defined a young tree as a tree under 15 years of age. And young trees don't need a lot of pruning, but they take a lot of pruning. There's nothing you can do to them that they won't outgrow because they're all young dynamic wood. They're kind of like, 10-year-olds. They can fall off a ladder and be just fine. Can't do that with a 90-year-old, but works fine with a 10-year-old. With your young tree, you're just going to take off the suckers that come off the rootstock. That's a true sucker, not a water sprout, and you want to cut it off. And you want to cut off the epicormic shoots that are coming off the trunk. See, we're starting from the bottom and working up, and any dead stubs and any dead wood. And then we're going to look at your tree. You could just leave well enough alone and not worry about it. But if you want to mess around with your young tree, that's fine too. You want to take off the lower left-hand branch that's broken. And on the right-hand side, moving from the bottom up, I see a straight shoot that's kind of bugging me. And I haven't exceeded my pruning budget, so I'm going to take it off. And then right above it is Mr. Wrongway. He starts on the outside of your tree and crosses back through the center. And he's crossing and rubbing. And it would be good to take him off. And I guess I'm going to leave the rest alone for now. And just know that all the branches you see on the lower part of this young tree are temporary. As the tree grows up, I'm going to take them off unless it's out in the middle of a field where it can be as broad as a barn. If it's in your backyard, you're probably going to want to limit up, especially if it's going to be a big tree. Temporary branches. As the tree grows up, you take off the temporary branches a few at a time, not all at once. So here's a young tree that's in a parking strip, and it has a lot of lower branches that are going to be taken off as the tree grows up. But now they're actually headed into foot traffic and out into the parking space. And we don't want to take them off now because they're feeding the lower part of the trunk and making that part of the trunk strong. So this is a broken rule. We're actually just going to head it back, whack it back to no place in particular, like I told you not to do, so it can just sit there and photosynthesize and feed the trunk for a while. And after it grows up some more, I will take them off completely back to the branch collar. Here's a tree on a parking strip that should have been limbed up earlier or crown raised. It's actually getting a little bit late. And I'm going to take off probably 2 this year and 2 next year and 2 the year after that. And as I cut them off, I'm going to use the 3-cut system. And I'm going to take them off not across from each other and not one above the other, because that would cause sort of rot to coalesce between the two. So I'm going to do 2 at different heights and sides. And then next year I'm going to swap out and do the other 2 at different heights and sides of the trunk. And as the tree grows up, I will continue taking off some of these lower branches until it's way up over the heads of everybody and all their trucks. Let's talk a little bit about double leaders and included bark. A leader is the main trunk of a tree, and occasionally a tree has many leaders or trunks. And a lot of times those leaves and trunks are so close together that you get something called included bark, which is not a good thing. Here's a two-trunked tree or a double-leadered tree, and where the two tree trunks meet, there's a seam. And in that seam is nothing but bark. There's nothing holding these two side trunks together, and this tree is very likely to fall apart. You can have included bark between a branch and a trunk or between two trunks. And what it means is that there's no connective tissue between them. There's just bark, which is preventing the trunk from holding together. This one's just scary to look at. And what would you do in a situation like this? Well, if I had this tree, I'd take it out fast. If it's in the middle of the woods and there's nobody around, it can just fall apart when it feels like it. Another thing that you could conceivably do is, well, no, this one's way too far gone. This is just too much. And how can you tell if you have included bark? Well, if the bark is pushed up, sort of like a little mountain range, that's okay. But if it disappears, and I don't know how else to say this, but it looks like the crack in your butt, then that means it is included and it is likely to fall apart, and you need to be concerned. If it's a little tree and it falls apart, it's not going to hurt anything. You just kind of go, look at that. That's amazing. If it's a big tree, you want to consider your options, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This is what happens when you have a tree with included bark. Big storm comes, a third of the tree falls out. I had a client that had a massive blue atlas cedar with two enormous trunks with included bark. And, it had lived for many years with that included bark. And I remember looking at it and thinking, if that falls apart, what's it going to hit? Well, if this side goes, it's going to crush the house. And if that side goes, it's just going to land in the yard. And it really looks like that's the side that's going to go. So I just didn't say anything to her. And sure enough, in a great big windstorm we had, entire half of this enormous tree fell out in her landscape, and then we had to take the whole thing out. A risk assessment, which is the art of judging how dangerous a tree is really a game of inches. You can prevent included bark from happening in your tree with early training. There's not much you can do with a big old tree, but if the tree is young and you have two leaders that are very close together and the bark is about to get trapped between them as they increase in size, you can step in and take off one of those leaders and favor the other one. And it doesn't really matter which one. And even if there's like a big kink in the trunk now, just know that over time it will smooth out and just be a graceful S-curve. But it's best that you get to this soon rather than let it be a problem 30 years down the line when that entire side of the tree falls out on the house. The cut you make is a very steep cut. It's kind of scary because there is no branch collar. And there is an upper limit to the size of a cut you can make. I get really nervous when I see a cut over, 2 to 3 inches. After it gets 2 or 3 inches big, you want to start considering other alternatives. Here's a street tree, and this is kind of the last minute you can take out one of these leaders. I'm sorry I don't have a better picture, but this was a drive-by. And some people would say it was just butchery, but this is such a young tree. Even if the entire trunk were to rot out from this heavy-handed cutting, all the new rings will be sound. And you can have a hollow tree as long as the walls are thick enough, just like a pipe. So you want to get it while it's young. You don't want to wait for it to be old to make this kind of a cut. So what if you have included bark looks like it's going to occur on a somewhat older tree, a middle-aged tree, 20, middle-aged for a tree. In the 20 to 40-year range, you can decide to favor one of the leaders by shortening the other one and giving the other leader more access to light and energy. So by shortening using your reduction cut, one of the leaders, you're actually going to turn it into a side branch with a collar, and you can take it off later or just let it be a side branch with a collar and let the main stem take over. Once you get to a situation like this, you're in a lot of trouble. This is a full-grown tree. You could conceivably cable the two leaders together, which means that they basically attach a bolt and a cable between the two leaders. It seems a little Middle Ages, and I can remember hearing about it. I asked my arborist if he thought it really did any good, and he said he thought it did. So we still do cable trees. There's a fair amount of physics involved, and you want to get an arborist who knows what he or she is doing. And you can also thin this out so that there isn't as much pressure on these two included bark stems. So let's see now. We've talked about thinning. We've talked about getting rid of included bark. We've talked about crown raising. Now we're going to talk about crown reduction, which is not generally a good thing. It's not as bad as tree topping, but its nicer cousin is called crown reduction. It used to be called drop crotch pruning, and it's kind of like the right way to make a tree smaller, except you shouldn't be making your tree smaller. You might ask why you shouldn't make your trees smaller, and the answer is crown reduction pruning does allow rot to get into the tree. Not as bad as a flat-out top job, but certainly not good like removing a side branch to the collar. So it's hard on the health of a tree. They also speed up their growth rate and just get broader. I have never seen a tree other than a fruit tree successfully kept down with reduction pruning. But it can be useful if, for example, you just want to crown reduce the one branch that was broken in the storm. And there's a couple other times when it's okay. This is an illustration of what crown reduction pruning is supposed to look like, and you really only get about 10% shorter if you're going to try and prune your tree all over for size reduction. And I can think of a couple of times this might be okay. I would do it for a customer on a young tree if they insisted, and I would just do this knowing it wouldn't work in the long run, but eventually the customer is going to die or move away, and then the tree will be set free. I would not do this on an old tree because that would be very damaging, and I would not use big cuts. This would be perfectly okay on an apple or a pear tree, and in fact, you would probably want to do it a little heavier, but that's another topic. Another time you use the crown reduction cut is for utility line clearance, whether or not it's for the power lines or for your trucks or whatever it is. Sometimes you use the reduction cut. This is the perfect street tree, 8 feet tall for pedestrians, 16 feet tall for trucks, and 30 feet short for power lines. We really ask an awful lot of our street trees. Really the best place for your tree is in your yard where it can crown out over the power lines. Instead, we keep jamming them in these difficult areas. This is an impossible situation. This is a large growing tree under power lines. Plant amnesty is the utility line clearance arborist's best friend because we actually understand what they're up against and what their options are. And there are no good options for power line clearance guys. They're yelled at if they let the tree grow in the wires. They're yelled at if they top the tree. They're yelled at if they utility clearance prune the tree. And they're yelled at if they take the tree out. And there are no other options. There is no nice way to keep a tree small. They would have to be up there every week nibbling away at all the branch ends using a billion little reduction cuts if they weren't going to hurt it, in which case you'll just have a small twiggy ball and a stick instead of a great big beautiful oak tree, in which case you might as well just plant a Paul's scarlet hawthorn to begin with. Why spend $1 billion trying to keep a big tree small when you can just plant a small tree? Anyway, it's a very difficult situation because people love trees and they hate wires, but they do love their electricity. It's not so important if the trees get in the lowest wires because those are really telephone and cable wires. You might think differently about that. But the next wire up is called the neutral, and it is only energized if the system gets broken. And technically speaking, they're supposed to keep the trees out of those, but it's not a big deal. What's a big deal is when the power lines, when the trees get up in the 3 wires on the very top of this power pole, those are highly energized. They are not insulated. If a branch drops across 2 of them, it'll short out the power for, miles. Kids get into trees near power lines and periodically electrocute themselves. And if the power line clearance guys didn't go in and do these nasty things to trees, our lights would be going out every week. We just don't see the fireball explosion, but trust me, it would happen if we let all the trees get up in the power lines. So this is a slide of correct line clearance pruning. It looks like the letter V. It is also called rabbit ear pruning, where they're not actually trying to keep the tree short. They're actually training it to either side of the 3 wires. This is not a good thing to do to a tree, but this is the only thing they can do to a tree, and they actually legally must do to a tree if the homeowner will not let them take it out, and the homeowner rarely does. So take it easy on those guys. They're in a really tough spot. And this is kind of a gentle reduction pruning on a tree. I think it's a conifer. And notice how it just looks like a partially eclipsed moon. They have just nibbled it away from the 3-phase wires so that we can get our uninterrupted electricity. And you wouldn't notice that there's this little notch out of it if you're actually walking on the street or facing it from any other direction than this. So, my hat's off to this guy for doing a nice, gentle job.